Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Okay, today we continue with our study of, this is chapter 7 in the book, the chapter on the path to liberation. Okay, now last week I spoke about the Noble Eightfold Path. And what I find somewhat interesting is that in all of the Nikayas, this is the collection of the early Buddhist discourses, the Buddha emphasizes again and again the Noble Eightfold Path as being the way to the cessation of suffering, say the way to liberation from suffering. But we hardly find in the discourses dealing with the Noble Eightfold Path anything that we can call like a systematic explanation of how one actually practices the Noble Eightfold Path. Rather, the explanation of the Noble Eightfold Path comes down to us in the form of, we call this a fixed set of standard doctrinal definitions. So the sutta that I included here on the Noble Eightfold Path, this is on page 239 and 240. This brings together what this is, you'd say, the paradigm for the explanation of the Noble Eightfold Path that we find in the Nikayas. And there's a whole section in the Samyutta Nikaya, a whole chapter called the Magga Samyutta, which means the collected sayings, collected discourses of the Buddha on the path, that is the Noble Eightfold Path. And in that whole chapter, one finds only one sutta which gives an actual explanation of the path factors. And that is the sutta that I've included in this book, that is this chapter 45, sutta number 8. In all of the other suttas that come in this chapter, the Buddha praises the Noble Eightfold Path in various ways. He shows how the path fits into various contexts, the purposes of the Noble Eightfold Path, but we don't get anything like the systematic explanation of how the path is practiced as an integral whole. There's one other sutta that comes in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is sutta number 117. It's called the Discourse on the Great 40, Mahachattalisika Sutta. This sutta gives it casts an interesting highlight on the Noble Eightfold Path from certain angles, but again it doesn't give an actual systematic explanation of how the path is practiced. But there are other discourses which give an explanation of how what we could call the Buddhist training, the training on the way to liberation, is to be substantiated. Discourses which lay out the gradual unfolding of the practice. These discourses are not expressly formulated by way of the Noble Eightfold Path. But the way I see it, one could regard these discourses of showing from a different angle how the Noble Eightfold Path is to be put into practice. And these are discourses which deal with a topic that in Pali is expressed by the expression, or is, say, this lays out a practice which is signified by the Pali expression Anupubha Patipada, which means the gradual step-by-step practice. Yes, the word Anupubha means breaking it into its parts. Anu has the sense here of sequence, and Pubha means before. But when you put Anu and Pubha together, it gives a sense of gradual, or you could say graduated, sequential. And then Patipada means practice. Maybe Chinese would be Zidi Xing, but Zidi Shouxing. Zidi Shui, Shui. Okay, now the graduated practice occurs in many places within the Nikayas. It occurs in one form in several suttas in the Digha Nikaya, the collection of long discourses. Here we have a somewhat expanded version of the graduated training to fit out the requirements for the longer discourses. But the detail that we find in the Digha Nikaya is not really so important. So we could say that the best examples of the graduated training are found in the Majjhima Nikaya. And we find the full presentation of the graduated training in two discourses. One is Sutta number 27, which I've included in this anthology, and another is in Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 51. And then there's a variation on the graduated training that occurs in Sutta number 39 in the Majjhima Nikaya, actually Sutta number 39 in the Majjhima Nikaya. In another minor variation, Sutta number 53 and Sutta number 125. But the one that I like the best is Sutta number 27, which is included here. And this sutta has a special significance for the Sri Lankan tradition, because when the Arhat monk Venerable Mahinda, the son of King Ashoka, came to Sri Lanka in order to propagate Buddhism, this was the first formal discourse that he gave when he came to the kingdom and began to preach the Dhamma. So he used this discourse as the basis for his own sermons. Okay, now what is particular about the graduated training is that it shows the practice of the path in terms of the training of the monk or the monastic person. Now, this doesn't mean that the actual training is exclusively the domain of the monastic person. In fact, in some suttas on the Noble Eightfold Path, somebody comes to the Buddha and says, this practice, as I see it, is for those who have gone forth, who have left the household life. But the Buddha says, do not speak in that way. The Buddha adds, whether it's a person who has gone forth or who is living at home as a householder, if he is of right practice, then I praise that person. If that person is of wrong practice, then I blame and criticize that person. And the Buddha says, how is a person of wrong practice? If he has wrong view, wrong intention, wrong speech, wrong action, and so on, then I say he's following a wrong path. And then I criticize him. But if that person, whether a householder or a monk or a monastic, is following right view, right intention, right speech, right action, and so on, then I praise that person. Okay, so the actual practice of the Noble Eightfold Path can be undertaken by anyone, whether monastic or a layperson. But still, the practice, particularly of the higher stages of the path, right mindfulness, right concentration, and the development of insight, is best supported by certain conditions. These would be conditions of seclusion, conditions of simplicity in one's way of life, condition of lightness of duties, not being bogged down by many obligations and commitments, and having, we call, the leisure and opportunity to dedicate oneself fully to the practice. Also, we could say that the higher stages of the practice are supported by a purification that takes place in the earlier stages of practice. Purification in one's actions, purification in one's day-to-day states of mind, and then the conditions of seclusion, simplicity that one finds in the monastic life support these purifications of action, of one's thinking. Of course, this doesn't mean, by no means implies that everyone who takes up the monastic life is fulfilling these conditions. I mean, there are a fair number of monks, maybe fewer nuns, who can be quite unscrupulous and even corrupt in their behavior. But still the Buddha laid down he established a monastic order and laid down the governing guidelines of the monastic life to support wholehearted dedication to the practice. And so when the Buddha presents the gradual training, the step-by-step training, he presents it in the form of the training of a monastic person, of one who goes forth and then into homelessness and then takes up the full training that the Buddha prescribed for the monastic persons. Okay, so now we can turn to this sutta itself, and we find that it's laid out, as many suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya are, it's laid out as a response to a particular incident that occurs. So it's here the gradual training is not just presented in the abstract as a system of steps, but it is embedded within the context of a little story. And the story features a particular prominent Brahmin by the name of Janusoni. Janusoni was an advisor, a chaplain, one might say, to the king of the state of Savatthi, a major state in northern India. And so the Brahmin Janusoni enjoyed a very high degree of prestige within this state. And so one day he goes driving out of Savatthi in the middle of the day in an all-white chariot drawn by white horses. I think this was some indication of his stature. It's just like maybe a prominent senator, long-established congressman, or presidential advisor today would drive about in a limousine. He doesn't just go out in a Honda or a Toyota, but he has to go out in a Mercedes-Benz, preceded by a number of cars surrounding him, security men. Okay, so then the Brahmin Janusoni, as he's driving, he sees a particular wanderer, a wandering ascetic named Pilotika, coming in the distance. When they cross paths, then he asks them, "Where are you coming from?" in the middle of the day. And then this wandering ascetic says that he's coming from the presence of the ascetic Gautama. Here he refers to him by his family name. He's referring, of course, to the Buddha. And then the Brahmin Janusoni would have heard reports about the Buddha, because the Buddha was the religious advisor, we could say the spiritual advisor, of King Pasenadi. And so Janusoni asks what this wanderer thinks about the Buddha's wisdom. He asks whether you consider him to be a wise person or not. And then Pilotika says that he's not qualified to make any pronouncements about the Buddha's wisdom. And he says one would have to be the equal of the Buddha to be able to make a pronouncement about his wisdom. So then the Brahmin Janusoni, we're on page 242 now, asks on what basis this wanderer has such a high degree of confidence in the Buddha, the ascetic Gautama. And then the wanderer replies that there are 4 things that he's seen. He actually uses a simile of an elephant hunter who's seeking an elephant in the forest. And then when this elephant hunter comes across the footprints of the elephant, he sees that they're long and broad. Then he comes to the conclusion that somewhere at the end of this trail there is a big bull elephant. And so then the Brahmin, the wanderer, went on to fill in the simile. He said, I have seen 4 things which for me are like seeing 4 big footprints of a bull elephant. What are these 4 things that he's seen? He's observed that sometimes very learned Kshatriyas, these are members of the warrior caste, the administrative, the governing caste, come to the Buddha with critical minds, intending to refute him in debate. But when they get to the Buddha's presence, they don't, and start listening to the Buddha's discourse, they're not even able to ask him a question. But they listen to the Buddha's discourse, they become convinced by it, and then they become disciples or followers of the Buddha. Again, there come to the Buddha Brahmins, members of the Brahmin caste, who are very learned, very sharp minds. They come intending to refute him, and they become his disciples. Then there come learned householders who want to refute the Buddha, and they become his disciples. And then there come samanas, ascetics, wandering ascetics, who come to the Buddha intending to refute him. And again, rather than ask their questions, as they listen to the Buddha give his discourse, they become convinced by the Buddha and become his disciples. And so the wanderer says, these are the 4 footsteps that I've seen of the Buddha that have convinced me that he is indeed a fully enlightened one. Okay, when the Brahmin Janusoni hears this, then he becomes very impressed by what he hears. And so he gets down from his chariot, he joins his hands together, and then he utters some words of homage to the Buddha. And then he expresses the wish that someday he might be able to meet the Buddha. But then the sutta goes on to say that the Brahmin Janusoni went to the Buddha. Maybe this would be on some other day. It's uncertain. But he went to the Buddha, exchanged greetings with him, and then he related to the Buddha this whole conversation that he had with the wanderer Pilotika. But now the Buddha doesn't accept the explanation that the wanderer had given to Brahmin Janusoni. Here you can see the sharpness of the Buddha's mind. The Buddha says that this is not really sufficient grounds for placing confidence, complete confidence in me, and thinking, therefore, I am the fully enlightened one, and therefore my teaching is well expounded. Rather, what the Buddha says, he doesn't completely reject the simile of the wanderer either. But what he says is that the simile is only partially adequate, not completely adequate. And it's not yet at this point, after observing these things, that the Kshatriyas, the Brahmins, the householders, the ascetics become convinced by his sermons. That is not sufficient ground for placing trust and confidence in me as a fully enlightened one. And then the Buddha explains why this is the case. And it strikes me very remarkable, this explanation that the Buddha gives here. Because the Buddha was brought up as a prince. It said that he hardly ever went out of his palace. And yet he seems to know what is involved in trying to track down a bull elephant. Because in the Buddha's time, kings and princes placed a high premium on a big bull elephant. It was regarded as a prestigious symbol of one's authority as a king. And the big bull elephant would be particularly used in warfare. When the kings would have an army, one division of the army would be the elephant troops. And so the king would have this division of the elephant troops, and they would lead the way into battle in order to vanquish the enemy. Okay, so kings and princes, they would always have elephant hunters in their service who would roam the forest looking for these big bull elephants. And somehow the Buddha, though living in his early life as a prince, from his youth on, from his 29th year on as an ascetic, somehow was able to pick up the information of how one tracks down a bull elephant. And he uses very precise logical distinctions here, almost as though he were an 18th century empiricist philosopher. Okay, he says that when one is wandering in the forest, just seeing big elephant footprints, long and wide, this is not yet a sufficient ground for coming to the conclusion these tracks were made by a big bull elephant. And then he gives 3 cases in which one might see big elephant tracks, and yet these tracks are not made by a bull elephant, but by another type of elephant. But it's only in the 4th case, when one sees the big elephant tracks, and then one traces these tracks right close to their end, and then one sees in the distance One doesn't want to go too close. One has to keep a safe distance, but one sees in the distance, at the end of those tracks, one sees the big bull elephant. And at that point, when one actually sees the big bull elephant, then one comes to the conclusion, there is a big bull elephant. And so we could say that this simile is illustrating what it means to come to the conclusion that the Buddha as the teacher, the one who is giving this teaching, is in fact the one who is fully enlightened, and that his teaching is well expounded, and that those who follow his teaching are following the good path. And so we could say that the whole discourse is oriented towards drawing the conclusion, what does it mean to know the Buddha, to be the Buddha, the fully enlightened one? Or what does it mean to see the Buddha himself, to really see the Buddha? And so within this context, the Buddha is going to lay down the graduated step-by-step training. And here we come to paragraph of section 11, where the Buddha first lays down, we can say that this paragraph is dealing with the two preconditions for the graduated training. These are not actually steps of the graduated training themselves, but two preconditions. We could call these even further, we could distinguish these as external preconditions. Okay, the first of these is that a Buddha has to arise in the world. So it says that here a Tathagata appears in the world. Tathagata, of course, is the designation for the Buddha. It could mean either thus come or thus gone. In Pali, the way words are formed in Pali, there's some ambiguity about the original meaning. Yeah, the word tatta means thus, and then the word agata means come. And so when you combine tatta and agata, then you get tathagata, which thus could mean thus come one, the one who has come thus. But we could have another derivation, tatta plus gata. And when you put tatta plus gata together, you get the same compound, tathagata. But here meaning thus gone one, the one who is gone thus. The sutras themselves don't give an actual explanation of the word. It could even have been a word used amongst many of the spiritual communities in India in the Buddha's time. Not exclusively Buddhists. But the Buddha took this word over, used it as a designation for himself. And then the commentators have given long, extensive explanations of the word, virtually trying to fit the whole body of Buddhist doctrine into the explanation of this word. I won't try to venture my own theory about what the word originally meant, since I haven't formed any such theory. So anyway, the Buddha here indicates the precondition for the first precondition for the gradual training to be made known. That is, a Buddha has to arise in the world. And then the Buddha goes on, this is the stock passage, This could have even been added by the compilers of the canon. The stock description of various epithets of the Buddha. The Buddha, the Tathagata, is an arhat. Here, the word arhat means one who has completely eliminated all defilements. So this is a quality that the Buddha has together with his disciples who become arhats. They've all eliminated all the defilements. He's perfectly or fully enlightened. He's perfect in knowledge and conduct. Fortunate, I think maybe not such a satisfactory translation. Again, it's a word difficult to render. Sugata, maybe we could say Sugata, exalted one. He's an exalted one. He's a knower of the world, unsurpassed leader of persons to be tamed, teacher of devas and humans. Then comes the word Buddha, which means enlightened one, and then Bhagava, which is translated the blessed one, not so literally. Bhagava actually means the one who is, say, regarded as the foremost teacher. Okay, so this is the first precondition for this graduated training, is the arising of the Buddha. Then comes the second precondition, which is the teaching of the Dhamma. So now the Buddha, having realized with his own direct knowledge this world with all of its beings, makes it known to others. So the Buddha fully comprehends, you could say, the nature of the world, and then teaches the nature of the world to others. And how does he teach it? That is, he teaches a Dhamma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right or proper meaning. It's endowed with rich meaning, abundant meaning, and it's also excellent in expression, well formulated, precisely, carefully, systematically, thoroughly formulated. And then he reveals a holy life, or we could say a spiritual life, that is perfectly complete and purified. And so here, under this second precondition, which I call the teaching of the Dhamma, we actually have two subordinate aspects. One is teaching the Dhamma itself. In this sense, the Dhamma has a more limited meaning as the doctrine which reveals, expounds, analyzes, discloses the principles that underlie the nature of the world, or the principles that underlie the process of the world, of worldly events. So here we would take such principles as the three characteristics, dependent origination, the Four Noble Truths, and other related principles. Okay, so that is the first aspect under the teaching of the Dhamma, is the teaching of Dhamma as doctrine. The doctrine that exposes, reveals the nature of the world and the principles and laws that underlie the working of worldly events, the cosmic process. Then the second aspect of the expounding of the Dhamma is revealing a path, the path of practice. And this path is called brahmacharya. Okay, the word brahmacharya, this was an old Indian word, probably going back generations, even centuries before the Buddha, that the Buddha adopted and then made a kind of plank or pillar of his teaching. The word charya means conduct, a way of life, and then the word Brahma has the meaning of, originally in Indian thought, it meant the holy power that sustains the world. And then the teachers of the Upanishads use the word Brahma to signify that ultimate reality that lies behind the whole cosmic manifestation. The Buddha didn't accept the idea of Brahma in this sense, of there being some ultimate substantial reality behind cosmic events. The Buddha rather used the idea of laws or principles, but he took over this term Brahma as signifying maybe something like the English word spiritual, rather than being a universal spirit, but there's some kind of spiritual principles that we should respect, honor, and follow. And when you take the idea of spirituality and join it with charya, a way of life, then we have a way of life which is guided by spiritual principles, a way of life which brings increasing spiritual depth to one's mind, to one's understanding, and a way of life which culminates in the highest spiritual realizations. And so this is the meaning of brahmacharya. And then the Buddha describes this brahmacharya that he teaches as a kanta paripunam parisuddham. That means it's perfectly paripuna, complete, and then a kanta parisuddham, perfectly purified. And then some commentaries say, the commentaries say it's perfectly complete because there's nothing to be added, and perfectly purified because there's no need to remove anything. Of course, commentators then go on to expound different aspects of the path in much greater detail than the Buddhist text, the early Buddhist text do. But we also have to remember that this is an important thing to remember, that the Buddhist sutras that have come down probably don't contain the full depth or the full detail of the Buddha's own expositions, but they are virtually summaries of what the Buddha himself would have actually taught. And so probably a lot of the detail which makes the teaching perfectly complete is not available within the discourses themselves. Okay, so this paragraph 11 lays down the two primary preconditions for the gradual training to be known: the arising of the Buddha and his teaching of the Dhamma. And then the teaching of the Dhamma has two subdivisions: the teaching of the doctrine that discloses, expounds the nature of actuality, the nature of the real nature of things, and the revealing of the practice, the spiritual life that leads to fulfillment, that leads to the goal. Okay, then with paragraph 12, we come to internal conditions that have to be met for the graduated training to be fulfilled. First, there has to be the hearing of the Dhamma. And here I have to ask the lady folks to please excuse or pardon me, or not so much me, but the texts themselves, because India was a male-dominated society. And so the Buddha, or the Buddha's texts, expound many of the teachings in terms of the male. So it's a householder or householder's son or one born in some other clan hears that Dhamma. Okay, so one doesn't have to be a householder or a householder's son, but the precondition is that one has to hear the Dhamma, or one has to encounter the Dhamma in some form. And then on hearing the Dhamma, one acquires faith in the Tathagata. The Pali word here, rendered as faith, is saddha. I know that the translation faith sometimes gives trouble to people who are brought up in a Protestant, particularly a Protestant background, maybe some with a Catholic background. Since I don't have that background, the word faith doesn't particularly give me any trouble. And some translators render saddha as confidence, which to me seems a little bit weak. Some render it as trust, which I think captures the essential idea of saddha. The word saddha doesn't in any way imply blind, unquestioning belief, submission to a higher authority. But to me, the word saddha, definitely within the text, the word saddha has a certain rich emotional connotation, which I feel gets lost by rendering it as simply as confidence, or even as trust. Trust is an important aspect of saddha, but doesn't capture it completely. Saddha does involve a certain cognitive aspect, a certain aspect of understanding. But it does imply that one understands or accepts intellectually the principles, the teachings made known by the Buddha. But more important by that is the kind of emotional response that is characteristic of saddha. It's a response of acceptance, a response, again, of placing this trust, a response of the will, arousing the will to act on what one understands. And it also involves, you could say, this devotion or affection towards the Buddha and his teaching. And so to have saddha, as explained here, this entails more than simply understanding intellectually the teaching, more than simply believing the teaching. But it means that the teaching so acts upon one that one is stirred, inspired, aroused, and willing to make a commitment to the teaching, to undertake the practice of the teaching. And this practice begins here in the way it's going to be explained in this sutta. It's going to be explained as the impulse, the motivation to follow the Buddha into the homeless life, the life of renunciation. And so when one gains faith in the Tathagata, the gaining of the faith, this is I call this the second internal condition. First internal condition is listening to the Dhamma. Of course, after listening to the Dhamma, one then has to reflect on it, to understand it. But as one reflects and understands, at a certain point there arises faith, trust, devotion, and a readiness to make a commitment. And so then possessing that faith, one now considers that the household life is crowded and dusty. It's crowded, there are many obligations, many duties. If you're a husband, you have to please your wife, you have children, have to look after the children. The wife often has to go shopping, cooking, sometimes driving the children to school and back. One has to work at a job to support the family, 6 to 8 hours a day. So many commitments. And then the household life is dusty, in the sense that it provides a field for the unwholesome qualities of mind to arise. Naturally, there's sensual lust, desire. Acquiring wealth leads to possessiveness, sometimes greed. Conflicts at work lead to anger, competition, and so on. Whereas the life gone forth is wide open. This would be particularly the case, I have to say, during the Buddha's day, in the early days of Buddha's history, when there were not so many well-established monasteries and where one doesn't belong on a permanent basis to a particular monastery, but one can travel about, going from place to place, even live out in the open most of the year. And so one is very much a free individual. Okay, so then one reflects, it is not easy while living at home to lead this spiritual life which is utterly perfect and pure as a polished shell. So then after reflecting in this way, then he goes on to consider, suppose I shave off my hair and beard, put on the ochre robe, and then go forth from the household life into homelessness. Okay, then having reflected in this way, sometime later, he abandons his personal fortune, he leaves behind his relatives, he shaves off hair and beard, and then goes forth into homelessness. Okay, so now this becomes, we would say, the third internal condition, or the fulfillment of this graduated training, that is, the going forth into homelessness. And again, I have to add that going forth into homelessness, it's not a necessary condition for the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path. But when the Noble Eightfold Path becomes incorporated into this graduated training, then the going forth becomes a precondition for it. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to present the graduated training in a step-by-step manner. In another sutta, he compares this to the way the great ocean gradually descends. It doesn't descend just suddenly, drop suddenly, but one goes into the water from the shore, and the water is just up to one's ankles. Then one goes a little deeper, the water comes up to one's knees, one's thighs, one's waist, one's chest, one's neck. And as one goes further, the ocean becomes too deep to support one's body. And so in the same way, this graduated training proceeds step by step from the simple or superficial stages to the deeper, more difficult, and more fulfilling stages. And so, again, we have in the graduated training, we could say that it is incorporated into the framework of moral discipline, mental training or samadhi, and the training in wisdom or insight. But it takes these three basic stages and then introduces finer distinctions, finer subdivisions. Okay, so we begin with the simplest stage, the most elementary stage. This is the training in moral discipline or proper conduct. Okay, and so when this person has gone forth, then he undertakes the monastic training and way of life. And here the Buddha now will introduce the basic ethical principles in the training of the monk. First, we have the destruction of life. He abandons the destruction of life, abstains from the destruction of life, and with rod and weapon laid aside, conscientious, merciful, he dwells full of compassion to all living beings. Okay, within this one statement, if we look at it carefully, we can see that there's actually a distinction being made, or a distinction can be made, between two aspects of this first ethical principle. And this twofold distinction will run through many aspects of this moral training, this ethical training. We call these two aspects of each of these training rules. We have two Pali terms. The word varita comes from the root var, which means to restrain. Varita means the aspect of restraining or the aspect of abstinence, avoidance. So we could say that this is moral virtue or ethical virtue from the perspective of what one is avoiding, what one is abstaining from. And here, this is expressed as abandoning the destruction of life. One abstains from the destruction of life. So this is the abstinence aspect of virtue. But then there comes another aspect to ethical virtue. This is the aspect of what one does, how one behaves, how one conducts oneself. This is what is called in Pali charita, from the root char. Has anybody ever come across any other words from the root char before? Whoever has come across any other word from the root char, raise your hand. We can't take the Pali students. That's anybody who's ever come across another word? Who hasn't come across another word from the word char? Raise your hand. Wow, I'm surprised. But I think, Kate, maybe what is the word from the root char that you've come across?
It's an English word.
No. That's what it is. It's right on the blackboard. Whiteboard. Yeah, I just explained it 5 minutes ago. Excuse me?
I thought it's excluding this one.
No. You're trying to wiggle your way out of it. Okay, so the word charity comes from the charita, comes from the root char, which means to do. So this is, say, the aspect of virtue as the way one behaves, the way one conducts oneself. And in this statement, this is expressed as dwelling conscientious, merciful, maybe merciful, not so good, dayasam, That means you say kindly, full of kindness, and then dwelling full of compassion towards all living beings. Okay, then the next one, also we have these two aspects. Abstaining from taking what is not given, and then the positive aspect is taking only what is given, and dwelling in purity, or you might say dwelling in honesty. Perhaps that's more precise in this context. Okay, you can see, if you're familiar with the 5 precepts, that we're actually following here the pattern of the 5 precepts, or the 10 courses of wholesome action. But now with the 3rd, we have a little change. Normally in the 3rd precept, the 3rd type of wholesome action, it's abstaining from sexual misconduct. But here this is the training for the monastic person. So it's abandoning sexual relations. One observes celibacy, living apart, refraining from sexual intercourse. Okay, now these 3 principles, ethical principles that are laid down, these govern bodily behavior. The next 4 govern speech. We have abstaining from false speech. Again, that's varita, avoidance. Then the positive aspect, the aspect of charita, the way one behaves, is speaking the truth, adhering to truth, being trustworthy and reliable, not deceiving anybody in the world. Okay, then we come to the next is abstaining from malicious speech. What is meant by malicious speech here? This is speech which is intended to divide people who are united and on friendly terms. And so this is elaborated that he does not repeat to one group what he has heard from another group in order to divide those who are united. This is a principle very difficult to observe if one is involved in party politics, which thrives on spreading malicious rumors about a person in order to alienate his followers from him. Okay, so the positive aspect of this is speaking words that promote concord, that bring people together on friendly terms. Okay, next one abstains from harsh speech. Then the positive aspect describes the type of words that one should speak. Words that are gentle, pleasing to the ear, lovable, go to the heart. Words that are courteous, desired by many, agreeable to many. Then the next one, abandoning idle chatter, and then speaking, the positive way to speak is to speak at the right time, speak what is fact, to speak on what is good or meaningful. And then here now, this is especially for a monastic person, to speak on the Dhamma and the discipline. Okay, these are we call in paragraph 13, the first 2 paragraphs in section 13. These deal with the major ethical principles of the monastic life. Then there come, the next paragraph, a number of lesser principles or minor principles which are in some way, to a good extent, they introduce something of a change in the nature of sila, or moral training. Here we're not so much involved with actual ethics or morality itself, but this paragraph introduces what I would call the ascetic aspect of the monastic moral training. That is, we're not so much concerned here with fundamental principles of what's right or wrong, wholesome or unwholesome, but rather principles which lead to, conduce to the state of simplicity, which are supporting the proper attitude of renunciation, the principles which involve a life which is governed by detachment, not making demands on others, avoiding luxury and self-indulgence. Okay, so one is not to damage seeds and plants. This principle was largely laid down not because seeds and plants are conscious living beings and that to kill them is a case of unethical transgression, but in the Buddha's time there was a popular belief amongst the common people that plants have some kind of conscious life. This was a popular belief, and so if people saw ascetics killing plants, they would complain. And so the Buddha laid down a training rule not to injure seeds and plants. Okay, then the next is to eat only one meal a day. This was a kind of ideal. It's not fixed as a rule. But what is fixed as a rule is to avoid eating at night or outside the prescribed time. And the prescribed time for the monastic person is from daybreak, when light appears on the horizon, up to midday. After midday, then it's not the appropriate time for taking solid foods, though most liquids are allowable, like soft drinks, tea, herbal teas, and so on. Okay, then abstaining from different types of entertainment, different types of self-adornment, high and large couches, accepting gold and silver, accepting grain, and so on. Okay, we could just pass through these. You can read them at your leisure. So the last one does come to a basic, you'd say to a basic ethic. The last 2, 3 are actually governed by ethical concerns. Not to use false weights, metals, and measures, not to accept bribes or to deceive and trick people, and not to wound, injure, or plunder or inflict violence on others. Okay, so all of these together in paragraph 13, we say the major ethical principles and the minor guidelines of ascetic conduct. All of these together constitute sila, the proper conduct, proper behavior of the monastic person. And this proper behavior, this will form the foundation for the whole training. In some suttas, the Buddha compares this ethical training to the great earth, which is the basis or support for all the activities that take place in the world. So, whether it is farming, business, running of government, and so on, all these activities, the Buddha says, take place based on the earth, supported by the earth. And so he says the entire practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, the 7 factors of enlightenment, all of this takes place based upon proper conduct, proper behavior. Okay, but now as we enter the next stages of the training, we're going to see an increasing emphasis on what I would call the internalization of the training. That is, the objective here is to provide a support for going deeper into states of interiority, of moving deeper into the development of one's own mind, the purification of one's own mind. And then from there to move into higher stages of consciousness, and from that platform to move to true and accurate understanding of reality. Okay, and so paragraph 14, it still pertains to the training and ethical discipline, but it is concerned more with developing a particular inner attitude. And this inner attitude is what is called contentment. And so the monk is described as one who is content with robes to cover his body and with alms food to maintain his stomach. And wherever he goes, he sets out taking only these with him. Actually, he doesn't travel around carrying a supply of alms food with him, but what he takes is his alms bowl. And in Indian society, in the Buddhist time, as well as in most of the southern Buddhist countries today, monks gather their food by going on alms round from house to house. And so when one sets out just with the bowl, one doesn't have to worry, where am I going to get my food tomorrow? Am I going to have enough provisions to last me through the week? But one could be traveling in India from one coast, the west coast, to the east coast of India, and as a monastic person, all one needs is one's alms bowl. In the morning, one sets out on one's alms round, and when one stands in front of the house just quietly with the alms bowl, people see and they know here's an ascetic or a monk on alms round. They have faith, even whether they're Buddhist, Hindu, Jain, that to make offering to an ascetic, no matter what his religious connection, even the Christian missionary or a Christian priest, Christian monk, in a Hindu or Buddhist country, if he wears a distinctive robe and goes with an alms bowl, he will be offered alms at any house. And so one goes with the alms bowl, stands in front of the house, and people will make offerings. Very quickly one's bowl will fill up, and then one can support oneself from day to day. I did this myself. Sometimes I would go in Sri Lanka on a walking tour, and sometimes it gave me the greatest happiness, because in Sri Lanka it's a little different from Thailand and Burma, where there are fixed times of the day when monks go on alms round, and every day monks go on alms round. In Sri Lanka it's not so much the common practice. Usually people bring food to the temples and offer to the monks in the temples. But in Sri Lanka, if people see a monk walking with the alms bowl, going an alms round, they know immediately what it means, and they're very happy to give. And so I remember times I would walk through parts of Sri Lanka. It gets to be in the day, say 9:30, 10 o'clock, 10:30. And so I recognized it's now getting to be the time to go on alms round. I would put the things that I'm bringing in my bag, hide it away someplace in the bushes, and then just take the alms bowl and go from house to house. People in the houses are not expecting one to go on alms round, but you just stand there, and unlike in homes in America where the doors are closed, maybe husband and wife both working, in the villages it's getting to be like that in the towns and cities of Sri Lanka. But in the villages, because the climate is warm, people have the doors open, the windows open. It could be the woman is working in the house, and at a certain time maybe she'll come outside or just look out the door, and when it's just standing there with the alms bowl, she'll say, "Ah, a monk has come." And then she'll gather her children, and then they'll have a little food which they already have set aside, or which they already have prepared, and so they'll take a little food, brings them out, and then offer to one. And then one just recites a little blessing and then moves on to the next house. Okay, so in this way one could live very simply as a monastic person. And so the Buddha describes this, he says, it's just like a bird. Wherever it flies, whenever it travels around, the bird doesn't have to think, where am I going to live tomorrow? How am I going to get my food tomorrow? Am I going to have enough furniture there? But the bird just takes its wings. That's all it needs to go from, could be from New York State, and when the winter is coming, the bird will go to maybe to Florida for the winter, the Bahamas, Central America. So they don't have to instruct one another, are you packing this? Did you get these things into the car? Did you bring your your radio, your tape player? But the bird just takes off, bringing its wings along with it. And so in the same way, when the monk travels from place to place, all he needs are his robes and his alms bowl. This was the ideal standard during the Buddha's time. Don't think that many monks are living like that today. Nowadays also monks have monasteries, they have to worry, do we have enough furniture in the monastery? Do we have enough this type of equipment, that type of equipment? But there are still monks in the Buddhist countries who are living very much like this even today. Okay, so having the robes, the alms bowl, the monk experiences develops what is called contentment. And then the Buddha then concludes this whole section by saying, possessing this aggregate of noble moral discipline, this is noble sila, he experiences within himself the bliss of blamelessness. This is the bliss of not committing anything wrong, any kind of ethical transgressions. Okay, with the next section, we start to internalize this training a step further. Now we are moving from moral discipline towards the training in meditation, towards the direct training of the mind. And this training of the mind begins with an effort to keep the mind pure in one's day-to-day interactions, one's day-to-day involvement with other people and with circumstances, with situations. And for the monastic person, probably the main emphasis here is on avoiding or controlling the uprising of sensuality, sensual desire. But also, it's not only the arising of sensual desire, but also the arising of irritation, annoyance, ill will. These are the two major obstructions, the coarser obstructions. And both sensual desire and irritation, annoyance, ill will are sparked off or stimulated by our engagement with the external world, with the world of sense objects. And how do these states of sensual desire and ill will, how do they arise, what conditions they are arising, is the lack of proper restraint in one's interactions with the world. And so here, in order to prevent the arising of these unwholesome states, the Buddha lays down a training in what is called the restraint of the sense faculties. Okay, the word indriya came to mean the sense faculties, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. The word indriya, it has an interesting derivation. It's based on the word Indra. And Indra, in the Vedic teachings, was the name for one of the Brahminic, Vedic gods, the god who was usually the chief of the gods. Okay, so now Indra is the chief of the gods, and Indriya is what is related to or connected with Indra. And so the sense faculty, the sense organs, play a dominant role in our experience. They are, you could say, the ruling or controlling factors in our experience. And so just as Indra governs and controls the gods that are under him, so the sense faculties govern or control the mental states that arise through these sense faculties. And then the word samvara has the meaning of restraining or restraint. Has anybody ever seen a word related to, similar to, cognate of the word samvara before? If you've ever seen a word related, connected to the word samvara, raise your hand. If you've never seen a word related to, connected to the word samvara, raise your hand. Such a big change. This is how one learns one's lessons. Okay, what is the word related to, connected to the word samvara? Say out loud.
Varita.
Yeah, varita. Okay, they're both based on this root var, which means to hold in. So samvara means restraint of the senses. Okay, now in the Buddha's time, there were some teachers who taught that restraint of the senses means one makes an effort not to see anything that might provoke one's desire or craving or ill will. Not to hear anything. So one tries to avoid contacts as much as possible and just stays in a very quiet place. But the Buddha said that he explicitly rejected this type of training in sense restraint. He said in that case, the person who's making the best progress towards enlightenment would be a person who is blind and deaf, because he's not seeing anything provocative, not hearing anything provocative. But rather what the Buddha teaches is that the proper way, the effective way to exercise sense restraint is to really, one restrains one thing and then all of the senses are restrained. It's a little bit like trying to catch a groundhog. I've never actually tried this myself, but The groundhog has a system of tunnels under the ground. Suppose it has 6 tunnels. You want to catch the groundhog. What you do first, you locate the 6 tunnels. You block off 5 of them. And then if the groundhog is going to come up any place, it has to come up at the 6th tunnel. So then you set the trap at the 6th tunnel, and then you get the groundhog. And so, to exercise restraint over the 6 sense faculties, what is the 6th tunnel where you catch the groundhog? It's the mind faculty. So the problem doesn't lie with the eye, with the ear, with the nose, with the tongue, or the physical body. The problem lies with the mind. And what is it the mind does to cause these states of craving and aversion to arise? The way this happens is that the mind seizes or grasps upon the object that appears. And then by grasping upon the object in particular ways, then it starts building up mental states on the basis of that object. Through its own internal processes, it starts building up the unwholesome mental states. And the grasping of the object, the Buddha distinguishes into two subordinate aspects. One is called nimitta gahi, the other is anubhyanjana gahi. Okay, the nimitta, this is what's translated here as the sign. Maybe sign is not such a good translation. Now I would use maybe mark, since now the sign, word sign has come to signify something like a stop sign. But it's simply, we say, what's called the sign, the nimitta, is the most distinctive feature of the object. So in the case, say, of sensual desire, maybe first one perceives, a man might perceive, that's a pretty woman, a beautiful woman. So that is, then one grasps upon that with the mind, with that particular perception. So that's grasping upon the sign. Then anubhyanjana gahi, this means grasping upon the particular features, grasping upon the details. So after one gets the initial impression, that's a beautiful woman, then maybe one starts looking. Nice curly hair, sweet smile, glittering eyes, and so on. Elegant hands, nice way of walking. Okay, so one then grasps upon the features. It could be something which is irritating or annoying. Maybe one sees a person one doesn't like, first one gets the impression of that person. That is this annoying, irritating person, grasping upon the sign. The person walks into the room, immediately one grasps upon that sign. There's my arch enemy, who's never done anything wrong to me, but just somehow the person's presence just annoys me. Then the person comes down, maybe he's carrying a cup, puts the cup down on the table, and even the sound of the cup hitting the table fuels one's little bit of anger. Then the way the person takes a sip of tea or coffee, even sometimes the gesture becomes annoying. The person starts to speak, even asking me, how are you feeling today? But just the very sound of the voice is just turning my mind over into waves of irritation and annoyance. Even when I say, I'm very fine today, how are you? Okay, so when exercising the sense restraint, one doesn't avoid the sight, try to keep the eyes closed. Even though, I have to say, I've heard of monks who do that. Monks who, when they interact with women, always looking down. Maybe they're invited to a home for a meal. They walk in, the eye down. Take the meal with the eyes down. Speak to the group with the mind down. I've heard of the monk giving the sermon and saying, "Gentlemen, I'm going to explain to you such and such a saying today." And his novice disciple sitting next to him will nudge him and say, "Bhante, the audience is all women." Okay, but this isn't the kind of sense restraint that the Buddha emphasized, but rather not grasping at, and this is grasping with the mind. One perceives, but one doesn't let the mind dwell upon the perception and then build up its impressions and fantasies, its own impressions and fantasies based upon the sense object. And then the Buddha gives the explanation. Continuing the explanation, he says, if he left the eye faculty unguarded, then evil, unwholesome states, these are states of longing and dejection, we would say craving and aversion, might invade him. And so he practices the way of its restraint. He guards the eye faculty, and he undertakes the restraint of the eye faculty. Similar with each of the other senses. Hearing a sound, one doesn't grasp upon pleasant sounds or allow oneself to be irritated and annoyed by unpleasant sounds. Smelling an odor, tasting a flavor, feeling a tactile object, and even cognizing one's own thoughts, images, ideas, and so on. Okay, so then the Buddha says, possessing this noble restraint of the sense faculties, he experiences within himself an unsullied or unadulterated bliss. In the case of simple morality, this is in paragraph 14, the Buddha says that possessing this noble moral discipline, one experiences within the bliss of blamelessness. But now we come to a higher level of bliss. This is called an unsullied bliss. Okay, maybe at this point then I'll just pause and then ask whether there are any questions. Richard? Yes. I think take the microphone. Yeah, the microphone is on the first table.
I want to test it.
I noticed no mention of generosity in Ghana, and it's often described as the first thing to unpack. I'm curious about that.
Okay, generosity in the sense of the giving of material things is especially emphasized when the Buddha speaks about the three, these are called the three bases of merit, and the three, sometimes in the later formulation of the 10 paramitas or paramis, 6 paramitas, 10 paramitas. But now this is a monastic training. And so the Buddha is not going to emphasize the monastic person is giving material gifts. So there will be, in other contexts, when the Buddha is addressing the monastic order, in fact he says that there are two kinds of gifts, the gift of material things and then the gift of the Dhamma. And then he'll go on and say, householders provide you with material gifts, with your robes, alms food, dwelling places, and medicinal requisites. And you should present the householders with Dhammadana, the gift of the Dhamma. But since material giving, which is sort of the more fundamental, is the giving of course, sometimes when monks have extra robes, then they'll give to a monk who needs a robe. Actually, this does come in principles that the Buddha laid down for the Sangha, 6 principles of harmony and respect. One of them is sharing the material requisites. So when you get excess robes, excess alms food, sometimes excess lodgings, excess medicines, and refreshments, then you share them with the other monks and nuns. But in terms of the general emphasis on giving is assigned to lay people who will be seen as having the material means to acquire material things and then give them to others. Yes, to take the microphone.
One short quick question and then one maybe longer question. So English charity does come from charity? Or is that just...
I don't think so. Charita is originally a Latin word or Greek, Anybody know? Anybody know Latin and Greek? I don't think that there's a connection between them.
Okay.
I think I had looked up that point long ago and I didn't find it.
Okay. And the longer question is, I didn't quite get when monastic following the Buddha into homeless life becomes a precondition of the Eightfold Path. At some point you mentioned those.
I would not have said following the Buddha into homelessness is a precondition to a practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, since that is a statement that I would reject. What I think I said is that following the Buddha into homelessness becomes a precondition for developing or cultivating the higher or more meditative aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path, particularly right mindfulness, right concentration, and then the fuller training in Panya or wisdom. And I would say not an absolute precondition. I mean, this training can be undertaken by people who don't actually go into homelessness. But what should be noted is that if a layperson wants to undertake a training in intensive mindfulness aimed at concentration, samadhi, or panya vipassana, what they do in effect is to emulate the monastic lifestyle. One goes on a retreat to a monastery or meditation center. Often one will take monastic type of precepts, abstaining from any kind of sexual activity, sometimes not eating after midday, no entertainment, not even reading or writing, and then one is practicing pretty much full-time meditation. Okay, let's take it very back.
I have a general question for you.
Oh, okay. Voice is very loud.
Sorry. When we read about the training, whether it's layperson training or monastic training, and we try to implement these when we go outside the monastery hall, into the real world. And even in this society, in American society, and even in, for example, in this society, there's a lot of pressure on us as individuals to perform. If we are not going for better things, so as to speak, and not making certain progress in certain number of years, then we are considered losers.
Yeah.
And it is, I myself am finding it difficult to, how do I say it? How do you bring balance into following the Eightfold Path? And because to me it seems like it's a form of greed. If you want your next promotion, if you want more raise,
Or raise if you want to raise it.
raise money, if you want to acquire things because the television is constantly bombarding you with the advertisements, sooner or later you fall in the trap and you're like, yeah, I want this thing. Do you have any practical tips of what we can tell to ourselves when this is going on all around us?
Okay, this is a question that's not really pertaining to the subject matter that I've covered, so I have to be very, very brief, not try to deal with it in any detail. Okay, if one is living the household life, one does need a certain degree of material well-being, material comfort, material prosperity. Particularly if one has a family, one has to support one's children, make sure that they have sufficient clothing, they'll want toys, and then one wants to provide for their higher education. So of course one has to earn and try to advance in one's work career. Also contributes to one's own sense of self-worth, self-respect, to be able to fulfill one's job properly. Okay, so the Buddha didn't say to all of his householder disciples, leave aside your work duties, try to live like monks and nuns. But he recognizes very clearly that there's a difference in lifestyles. And so he teaches that the householder supports his family by, he uses the expression, he earns his wealth righteously in righteous ways, working with the strength of his arms and the sweat of his brow. Of course, because most of the working people in the Buddhist day were working either at farming, cultivation, or doing some type of physical labor. Okay, and so one should work, diligently, responsibly at one's profession, one's occupation. One should try to advance in one's work so that one earns sufficient wealth to look after one's material needs and to support one's family. But one doesn't make advancement a way of satisfying the demands of ego. One doesn't make getting a bigger and bigger salary a means just for indulging sensual desires, so that one has 10, 5, 6 homes, different parts of the country, 10 homes, whatever. 3 cars, even though, of course, maybe husband, wife need a car, but you yourself have 3 cars for different occasions. So one avoids work, let's say, in living the household life, one tries to avoid being driven by greed and pride, conceit. But one does act and conduct one's life in a way that will fulfill a sense of self-respect and earn respect from one's colleagues, one's neighbors, not to boost one's own ego, but it brings a kind of satisfaction, gratification. And then one works to fulfill one's responsibility to one's family and to other people. And then the Buddha also teaches that when one works diligently, works well, and acquires wealth, then one uses that wealth for beneficial purposes to benefit others. In fact, there's a sutta, I think I included this earlier in this anthology, where the Buddha explains to a householder how one divides up one's income and uses different portions of the income for different purposes. One uses one portion, I think it's 1/4, for supporting one's family and one's other relatives. One sets aside another portion for emergency. This is the ancient equivalent of an insurance. One uses another portion to make offerings to Brahmins and ascetics, the people who are devoted full time to a spiritual life. And then one uses another portion to pay, the tax to the king, to make offerings to the spirits, and so on. Okay, any further questions? I think it would be better if you do use the microphone.
Just a question with nimitta. The word nimitta, that part of the word, is that the same? I think I've seen that word in relationship to jhanas where they see a certain.
Right. This is the same word, but it has a different nuance, a different meaning in this context. Any further questions? Okay, if there are no further questions at this point, I don't want to go into the next section. I don't want to start that today because that requires a little more detailed explanation. So we can deal with that question, with that section the next time we meet. The next time we meet will be September 6th. Yeah, September 6th. This would be 2 Saturdays from now. Okay, we will now do the sharing of the merits, and then I will go take my lunch, which takes about 20 minutes to finish, and then I'll come back here at 12 o'clock. If anybody has other questions that they want to raise, then we can have a little discussion for about a half an hour. Now, I believe that lunch is prepared somewhat earlier on Saturday now, so I think by 11:30 it should be ready for visitors. So if any of you want to take lunch over in the dining hall, you can. But we'll start here at 12 o'clock and then have a discussion until 12:30. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merit. When we speak on the Dhamma and listen to the Dhamma, then we acquire wholesome karma or merits that we share with the devas. These are the deities, the bhutas or fierce spirits, the nagas or dragon spirits, wishing them to be well and happy and to protect the Dhamma, to protect the teaching of the Dhamma, to protect the world. Akasata Chapumata Nagamahitika Punyantam Anumodita Chiram Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chapumata Devana Mahitika Punyantam Anumodita Chiram Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chapumata Deva Naga Mahedika Punyantam Anumoditva Chiran Rakantu Mam Param Petavakacham Hehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sade Deva Anumodantu Sabha Sampati Siddhya Etavataja Hehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Bhutanumodhantu Sabha Sampati Siddhya etavatacha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe sutta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavadupadaya avicci hetato etantare satakaya upapanna rupya rupicha asanya sanyino dukha pamuchantu kusantu nibhuti. And my own personal test in sense restraint is going on right now. Thankfully, it didn't occur during the middle of the talk today. Otherwise, I might have exploded. Okay, thank you for your attention.